Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We spent a lot of time on this show examining crises of heat, global warming, heat domes, the sudden fiery ends of history.
We do, and they're terrifying in their own right.
But today, we're doing something different. We are peering through a very thick, icy lens into, well, what might be the absolute worst-case scenario. One that came not by fire or by flood, but by an inexorable creeping silence.
And an absolute unending cold.
The source material we're working from today is this chilling document. It's called the Dossier on the Eternal Winter.
It is perhaps the most chilling kind of apocalypse because it's so scientifically logical. It's not magic, it's not a monster. It outlines not just the death of the planet, but the precise geophysical mechanisms that locked it into a true Snowball Earth state.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. It's a heavy one, but it's crucial for understanding planetary mechanics. We're going to unpack the physics, the biology, and the radically altered sociology of this deep freeze scenario.
We really need to understand exactly how the planet lost its ability to regulate temperature.
Right, and what that final subterranean existence looked like for the last remnants of humanity.
And while the material is certainly disturbing, I think it's deeply instructive. It forces us to confront some fundamental scientific lessons about climate feedback loops, planetary resilience.
And just how incredibly delicate that window of habitability truly is.
So let's start where every crisis begins, with the trigger. How did the world lose its warmth and initiate what the dossier calls the Great Dimming?
Okay, let's unpack this. The dossier makes it immediately clear, and this is important, that the transition to the eternal winter was not a sudden, violent catastrophe, not a meteor impact.
No.
It was, and I'm quoting the source here, a creeping, inexorable theft of warmth.
That phrase is so effective. It implies a gradual decline that you might not even notice until it's too late. It crossed a critical point of no return, and then it accelerated.
So what's the trigger? What's the first domino?
What's fascinating here is that the initial trigger wasn't the cold itself, but an atmospheric shield built from fire.
From fire.
Yes. We are talking about an extremely active period of volcanism, a series of massive, prolonged eruptions centered along the Ring of Fire.
And when we say massive eruptions in this context, we're not talking about like Vesuvius or Mount St. Helens.
Oh no, not even close. You have to imagine orders of magnitude beyond anything in recorded human history, a planetary scale event.
So what did that do?
Well, this volcanic activity injected millions. The dossier suggests maybe even hundreds of millions of tons of sulfur dioxide straight into the stratosphere over a really compressed period.
And you have to picture that. A constant churning emission from the planet's core.
Exactly. And the key here, as the dossier points out, is that it wasn't the black ash, which is what we usually associate with volcanoes. That stuff is heavy, it falls out of the atmosphere relatively quickly.
Right, it rains out.
The real damage, the lasting damage, was the sulfur dioxide reacting with water vapor and sunlight way up high. It formed these persistent, ultrafine sulfate aerosols.
So this created a reflective aerosol veil.
Yeah.
It's basically a vast, persistent sunscreen, thousands of kilometers wide, that just stabilized high in the atmosphere.
You've got it. Its primary function was immediate. Block incoming solar radiation. Just reflect it straight back into space before it can warm the surface.
That initiated the cooling, a kind of severe planetary volcanic winter.
And that dimming, that atmospheric shield, it was just enough to drop global average temperatures below the critical freezing point for water, especially in the mid-latitudes. And that takes us directly to the true, irreversible engine of destruction.
The albedo death spiral.
Albedo death spiral.
That concept, it just sounds final. It implies a runaway mechanism, a positive feedback loop, but one operating on a planetary scale.
It is. So for anyone less familiar with the term, let's just quickly re-anchor on what albedo is.
Good idea.
Albedo is simply the measure of reflectivity. In really simple terms, how much light bounces off a surface versus how much is absorbed as heat.
So dark surfaces like a deep blue ocean or a lush boreal forest, they have low albedo.
Right. They soak up most of the solar energy and they convert it to heat, which is what keeps the planet warm.
But white surfaces like fresh snow or a giant ice sheet, they have a really high albedo.
Extremely high. They can reflect up to 90% of that incoming solar energy straight back into space. They're like planetary mirrors.
Okay, so the spiral begins when that initial volcanic cooling allows the existing polar ice sheets to start expanding. They're creeping down past their normal seasonal limits into lower latitudes.
Precisely. The initial cooling It spreads the ice, and it starts covering up areas that were previously massive heat sinks. Open ocean, dark coniferous forests, the planet's solar panels, essentially.
And as that white cover spreads, the planet's overall albedo just skyrockets.
It increases dramatically. We're not talking about a small change here. We're talking about the planet switching from absorbing, say, 2/3 of the incoming solar energy to reflecting back almost 90% of it.
It's staggering change in the global energy budget. It's like the planet just decided to stop paying its heating bill.
A perfect analogy. And you see the loop, right? Less heat absorbed means the Earth gets colder,
Which means more ice can form.
which increases the albedo even further.
It just locks itself in.
And here's where it gets, for me, really interesting, because the dossier notes this cycle became self-sustaining even after the volcanic atmospheric soot cleared.
So the original cause went away.
It did. Think about the time scale. The sulfate aerosols might linger for, a decade? Maybe 2? But the massive continent-spanning ice sheets they initiated, they're semi-permanent.
So the trigger vanishes, but the consequence, the sheer spread of reflective ice, is now the sole dominant driver of planetary cooling.
Exactly. The Earth's own natural cooling defense mechanism had been activated, but instead of protecting the system, it turned into an irreversible weapon against habitability.
I find that just astounding, that the ice layer remained the primary driver even after the initial trigger was gone. It suggests that once you pass that critical tipping point, that temperature threshold, the planet is essentially flying on autopilot toward a total freeze-out.
That's the textbook definition of a tipping point in climate dynamics.
Right.
The point where the internal processes of the system become more powerful than the external forcing that started it all. There's no mechanism left, no exposed dark ocean, no massive forest to absorb enough solar energy to even begin to initiate a thaw.
The end result, as the dossier describes it, was the Earth achieving a true snowball state.
And with that, the seasonal cycle, which the dossier refers to so poetically as the planet's heartbeat, it just stopped.
Imagine that. No spring melt, no summer warmth, just an eternal, monotonous, deep winter.
And crucially, the oceans, which are the great heat reservoirs of the world, they began freezing.
How deep did the source say this freezing went? This isn't just like a frozen pond.
No. This wasn't just surface ice. Starting from the poles, the freezing marched relentlessly toward the equator. And because the surface climate was now totally decoupled from the Earth's internal warmth, the ice grew thicker and thicker.
How thick are we talking?
We are talking about a vast, kilometers-thick sheet of ice covering nearly the entire globe, a massive thermal blanket.
And that blanket trapped the remaining internal heat of the Earth, the core heat, completely isolating it from the surface climate.
Yes. It created a profound barrier to any future warming. The Earth became this ice-covered sphere with a warm, churning core, but nothing on the surface could benefit from that warmth anymore.
So once those geophysical mechanisms were locked in, the biological fallout must have been immediate and total.
Terrifyingly fast. We often discuss climate change in terms of decades or centuries, but the dossier suggests the biological collapse was hyper-accelerated.
Let's transition then from the geology to the biology. What happens when that persistent, unrelenting cold finally settles in?
The dossier is quite brutal about this. It defines the global ecosystem as the global green lung, and the lung was, unsurprisingly, the first and most immediate casualty.
The timescale here is what gets me. The dossier says within 3 years. 3.
3 years? That's an incredibly rapid extinction event. Most of the world's forests succumb to what the source terms deep freeze necrosis.
Deep freeze necrosis. What does that actually mean at a biological level?
It's a comprehensive biological failure. It's essentially cell death caused by ice formation inside the plant tissues. We all know water expands when it freezes, right?
Right.
Well, in the vascular structure of a plant, in those tiny tubes, this expanding ice just shatters the cellular structures, particularly the xylem and phloem vessels that move water and nutrients.
So it's like a death from the inside out.
An irreversible structural failure at the microscopic level. The moment those interior cells freeze solid and are physically destroyed, the organism is just doomed.
And the source notes a specific chronology here. It suggests a difference in how fragile different biomes were. Deciduous trees, like maples and oaks, they went first.
They did. They're biologically programmed for dormancy, yes, but they absolutely require a cyclical release. They need a spring thaw to repair damage and restart their metabolic activity. They just are not built for an eternal winter where temperatures never rise above freezing for years on end.
And their root systems couldn't handle it.
Their shallow root systems couldn't handle the continuous, deep advancement of the frost line. Eventually, in many regions, that frost line reached solid bedrock.
And ironically, the hardy conifers of the taiga, the pines and spruces, they had a greater immediate resilience to the cold, but their fate was just postponed.
Exactly. They're adapted to extreme cold, sure, but they still rely on seasonal warming for nutrient uptake, for water movement, and all the necessary metabolic activity to create sap and resin.
When the heartbeat of the planet stopped,
When spring became just a slightly less frigid version of winter, even the mighty taiga died off. The sheer accumulation of snow and ice year after year, combined with the inability to repair freezing damage, it killed them. Slowly, but certainly.
so as the primary producers, the forests, the grasslands, even the tundra as they die, the massive global oxygen-carbon dioxide exchange just falters. What were the atmospheric consequences of this total biotic collapse?
The air itself changed dramatically. It became thin, brittle, and impossibly dry.
Why dry?
Well, remember, plant life is key to regulating atmospheric moisture through evapotranspiration. They're constantly breathing out water vapor. Once that vast reservoir of trees was gone, the little remaining water vapor in the air was quickly locked up as non-moving surface ice.
And the air composition.
The constant exchange of CO2 for O2 stopped. This meant the density and composition of breathable air changed for the worse, even for the few remaining survivors who were huddled in their artificial environments.
That just sets the stage for the inevitable trophic cascade, the complete collapse of the food chain starting at the very bottom.
It was a rapid mass starvation event on a scale that's hard to even comprehend. When the plants vanished, the herbivores had absolutely nowhere to turn.
The dossier gives these devastating accounts of mass die-offs. Megafauna deer, bison, elephants, cattle, just starving in the millions.
And you have to remember, these mass grazers, with their enormous bodies, they require huge, constant caloric input. Their metabolic needs simply couldn't be met by the dwindling, then non-existent food sources. Their extinction was swift and widespread.
And the consequences ripple outward, all the way to the apex predators.
The carnivores, the wolves, the big cats, the bears, they followed almost immediately. It's a common misconception that the cold killed them first.
It was the hunger.
It was hunger.
Yeah.
Pure and simple. Driven by the lack of plants miles down the trophic pyramid, they either starved or they succumbed to the immense physical toll of constant cold and failed hunts.
Now, we've talked about the land, but the dossier describes the oceans as dark tombs. That imagery suggests the death there was even more comprehensive.
It was, because the surface oceans are the largest engine of planetary life, and they're driven by phytoplankton.
Microscopic plants.
Exactly. But once the oceans were covered by kilometers of reflective perpetual ice, the complete lack of sunlight meant that photosynthesizing plankton, the very foundation of the entire marine food web, vanished almost instantly. The upper photic zones just became sterile.
So the surface oceans are sterile, dark, and silent, killing, what, 90% of marine biodiversity?
At least. But the dossier does offer a single critical insight, an exception that really demonstrates resilience.
Right. The life clusters that remained blissfully unaware of the frozen surface world, the communities built around hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor.
It's a fascinating point.
Wait, but if the surface world is frozen solid and the planet is in the state of entropy, how long could those deep-sea ecosystems survive? I mean, once the Earth's core eventually cools, isn't that just postponing the inevitable, ecologically speaking?
That's a really important question, and it speaks to the source material's focus on internal versus external energy. These deep-sea ecosystems, they don't rely on the sun on external energy for their primary production.
They're completely self-contained.
They rely on geothermal and chemical energy from the Earth's core internal energy through a process called chemosynthesis. They use sulfur compounds, not light, to create energy. They were perfectly insulated, both by the deep water and by the kilometers of ice from the climatic disaster happening above.
So they were safe.
While the entire planet faces eventual thermodynamic death, these pockets of life were shielded from the acute climatic disaster. They demonstrate that any viable long-term survival strategy on this new Earth must, by necessity, tap into that core internal heat source. They are these tiny, self-contained bubbles of resilience.
So the ecosystems have collapsed, biological silence has descended, and the planet is locked into ice. Let's shift our focus to humanity's attempt to survive this. Specifically, the fate of our greatest monuments, our cities. The dossier refers to them becoming urban glaciers.
This section of the source material is particularly vivid because it rejects all the typical disaster tropes. These great metropolises, New York, London, Tokyo, they weren't incinerated by nukes or flattened by earthquakes.
Nothing so dramatic.
No. They were systematically destroyed by the slowest, quietest, most relentless forces imaginable. The expansion of ice and the crushing weight of snow that just never melted.
Can you describe that failure mechanism in more detail? I mean, how does an engineered structure like a skyscraper, designed for strength, just succumb to cold and ice?
It's a fundamental material failure driven by thermodynamics. As soon as the cities went unheated, and they went unheated very quickly, water seeped into every minuscule joint, every crack in the concrete, every seam between steel supports.
And as the temperatures plunged and stayed perpetually below freezing,
That water expanded with immense, unyielding force.
we're talking about hydraulic pressure strong enough to shear solid rock. It's the same principle.
Exactly. Modern construction materials, steel and concrete, they're designed for rigidity and tensile strength, but they become incredibly brittle in permanent, deep cold. So the expansion of ice acts like millions of microscopic wedges, slowly prying apart joints and supports.
And then there's the weight.
Yes. This, combined with the slow, crushing, enormous weight of accumulated snow and ice snow that doesn't melt for years, even decades, it caused widespread structural failure. The source notes that railway tracks and major rail hubs were bent into these impossible geometric shapes by the continuous, shifting ice pressure.
So the cities didn't just fall down in a day. They slowly buckled, warped, and crumbled under geological pressure, becoming just another part of the glacier.
They became part of the landscape.
But before that architectural failure came the paralyzing failure of infrastructure. The dossier is clear. The electrical grids were the first critical systems to collapse, plunging the world into darkness.
The grid is a system of dependency chains. It's incredibly fragile. It requires constant maintenance, reliable delivery of fuel, coal, gas, diesel for backup generators, and constant human attention.
And once the mass die-offs and the migration started,
That highly complex, interconnected global system instantly lost its support network. Power plants went dark because delivery trucks couldn't reach them through the snow, or operators abandoned their posts to try and save their families, or the fuel itself froze in the pipes.
the dossier has that line, that the world's lights flickered out one by one. It's such a profound, quiet image of darkness descending across the continents.
And that darkness sealed the fate of anyone who hadn't already started moving.
Without heat or power, staying put was just a death sentence. And that forced the greatest human movement in history, the Great Migration.
The source calls this a desperate, bloody affair.
So where did humanity believe it could survive? What was the goal of this massive terminal movement?
The destination was singular, the thermal belt. This was the narrow strip of land around the equator.
The logic makes sense.
The theory was sound. Even in the deepest cold, this area received the most focused, direct solar energy, and it was geographically positioned near internal heat sources. The idea was the ice would be thinner, the cold marginally less lethal.
So everyone who survived the initial collapse, everyone who had the means or just the sheer will to move, was driven toward the tropics.
It was a movement of billions, pushing into areas that simply couldn't sustain that population density, and you have to imagine the logistical failure. Road networks were choked with abandoned vehicles, railroads failed because of buckling tracks and frozen fuel, air travel just ceased entirely.
A complete breakdown.
The movement was characterized by mass panic and brutal resource conflict over the final remnants of fuel stocks, medical supplies, and non-perishable food. The descriptor bloody affair reflects the geopolitical breakdown as nation-states dissolved, and it became every small group fighting for the last habitable land.
It sounds like the greatest humanitarian crisis in history compounded by planetary physics. But your analysis here is crucial. Even this sanctuary, this thermal belt, it was tenuous at best. What was the reality once they got there?
The reality was what the dossier calls the eternal November. The ice might have been thinner, maybe a few meters thick instead of kilometers, but the temperature rarely rose above -10 to 10 degrees CeLo.
Which is still extreme cold.
It's life-threateningly cold. It requires incredible energy expenditure just to stay alive, constant insulation, battling frostbite, all without functioning infrastructure, sanitation, or agriculture. It wasn't a reprieve from the winter. It was merely a marginally slower way to die than staying north.
So the surface had utterly failed, both in its engineered structures and its potential as a refuge. This necessitated the final radical retreat.
Yes. The failure of the surface world and the unsustainable nature of the thermal belt meant that survival dictated a complete permanent retreat into the Earth. This marks a radical new, almost troglodytic evolution for humanity's remnants.
They didn't just dig holes in the ground, though. They built the geothermal enclaves, entire cities carved directly into the bedrock right near the planet's internal heat sources. They're leveraging the Earth's last viable energy engine.
And the locations are incredibly specific. They are dictated purely by geology. The dossier pinpoints Iceland due to its intensely active geothermal crust.
Makes sense.
Parts of the African Rift Valley, leveraging tectonic heat and deep faults, and the caldera system in Yellowstone, which provided immense, reliable subsurface heat. These weren't arbitrary choices. They were the geological energy anchors, where deep core drilling could access sustainable heat and steam.
The source describes life in these enclaves as a study in monochromatic despair. That phrase suggests not just physical hardship, but a total transformation of the human experience.
Absolutely. Life became purely functional, stripped of almost all natural sensory input. Let's just detail the new necessities, starting with the most basic: food.
Agriculture, as we knew it, fields, sunlight, rain, is completely gone. A myth.
So food relies entirely on the food labs. These are highly engineered, closed-loop systems.
Right. Survival hinges on advanced hydroponic vats to grow the most basic, necessary crops. Things like nutrient paste and certain quick-cycle vegetables.
But the bulk of protein, the dossier says, relies on synthetic proteins derived from highly efficient sources. Fast-growing fungi and specific insect species. They are incredibly energy efficient, requiring minimal light and space to produce protein.
Imagine the psychological impact of that diet. The source details this profound sensory deprivation, describing the memory of a fresh apple's taste, or the smell of rain on hot asphalt as myths told to children who have never seen the sky.
It's heartbreaking. The complexity of natural flavor, texture, and scent is completely lost. Nutrition becomes purely functional fuel for maintenance.
And this reliance on closed functional systems ties directly into another crucial necessity for subterranean life: air quality. The atmospheric scrubbers.
When you concentrate thousands of people into closed artificial environments carved from rock, carbon dioxide, radon, other toxic elements, they build up rapidly. These scrubbers, they sound like the true heart of the enclaves.
They are arguably the most important pieces of technology remaining. They are these massive, constantly working machines, the planet's new artificial lungs, that filter the subterranean atmosphere, removing the toxic buildup of carbon and regulating pressure just to keep the residents conscious and alive.
The source really emphasizes that maintaining the chemical inputs, the replacement filters, and the energy flow to these scrubbers is the single highest priority of enclave governance.
In effect, if the scrubbers fail, the enclaves die of slow asphyxiation. It just highlights the knife edge they live on. They're completely dependent on complex machinery that must be maintained with zero access to external natural resources. Everything must be recycled, synthesized, or mined internally.
And this chronic confinement and dependency, it extracted a horrific psychological cost, which the source material terms the white madness.
This is a truly devastating consequence of their enforced survival. The dossier says it involves chronic hallucinations, severe cognitive decline, and existential depression.
And it makes perfect sense. We know humans are deeply biologically dependent on the 24-hour solar cycle, the circadian rhythm, which dictates sleep, hormone production, and our overall mood.
So if you're living under perpetual, unchanging artificial light, your body clock just completely disintegrates.
It does. And furthermore, the deprivation of sensory diversity, especially the color green, which is just everywhere in a healthy ecosystem, it caused widespread psychological breaks. The human mind is not built for monochromatic confinement, for a life where the outside is just white noise and ice, and the inside is gray rock and functional machinery.
It's the ultimate trade-off, isn't it? Physical survival came at the cost of collective sanity. The absence of natural variation, the lack of seasonal change, and the constant psychological pressure of knowing the entire world is dead above you. It led to severe, often fatal, mental instability among the populace.
This profound geological and sociological stasis, it brings us to the ultimate question we have to explore. Is there any way out of this freeze? Is the eternal winter, as the name implies, actually permanent?
And the answer the dossier provides is just chillingly mathematical. The eternal winter isn't just a climate state. It is, scientifically, a state of high-entropy equilibrium.
Let's delve into that, because it's where the physics gets most devastating. High-entropy equilibrium, or HE, means the planetary system has reached a state of maximum disorder in its energy distribution. Or, more accurately, it has minimal available useful energy, the ability to do work.
So the planet is thermodynamically dead. Its energy fluxes are balanced, but at an extremely cold, non-dynamic state.
And the critical problem is structural. The source details why the energy budget shifted so drastically. The energy required to break the ice cycle, to melt enough of that kilometer-thick sheet to lower the albedo and restart warming, now exceeds the current solar output that's reaching the surface.
So it's like the planet's thermostat is just broken, stuck on off.
It's a great way to put it. Think of it this way. Imagine trying to boil a massive, kilometer-deep pot of water using nothing but a tiny match. The match, in this case, is the solar energy that manages to penetrate the atmosphere and reach the ice.
And because the ice is so reflective, with its high albedo,
it instantaneously bounces 85–90% of that match's energy away. The tiny remaining fraction is simply not enough to overcome the massive thermal inertia, the sheer cold mass of the global ice sheet.
So the devastating feedback loop that created the crisis now sustains the crisis in reverse. The system is completely and totally locked. The initial impetus for a thaw solar heating is defeated by the result of the freeze, that massive reflective ice cover.
And that leads to the long, dark forecast. The Earth will remain a rogue adjacent ice ball for millions of years. It has essentially taken itself out of the solar system's habitable equation. It's functioning more like a stray asteroid or a dwarf planet than a dynamic, living world.
So the remnants of humanity huddled in the enclaves can't fix this. It cannot be an internal solution because the Earth has exhausted its ability to self-correct. What are the purely theoretical external hopes? Are there any?
The dossier is clear that any intervention would have to be catastrophic and external. One scenario it suggests is a massive asteroid impact.
An impact to save the world, not destroy it.
Exactly. Not to destroy the planet further, but to inject enough dust and kinetic energy to instantly vaporize a massive amount of ice. That would lower the global albedo instantaneously and initiate a temporary, high-volume greenhouse effect that might trigger a thaw.
Or a monumental change in the star itself.
A significant, multi-century increase in solar luminosity that could eventually force a thaw despite the ice's reflectivity. But both of these are completely outside the control, the influence, or even the immediate concern of the surviving remnants of humanity.
They're worried about their next meal and the status of the air scrubber.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it imposes a brutal philosophical shift on humanity's status. We are no longer the masters of nature, the dominant species shaping the planet.
The source material is quite poetic and brutal here, defining humanity not as stewards, but as nature's parasites huddled around the planet's cooling embers, those geothermal hotspots.
The illusion of our progress, our dominance, our ability to control our environment, it has been completely stripped away by planetary physics.
Civilization, viewed through the lens of this deep dive, was merely a brief, warm dream. It took place during a momentary lapse in the universe's cold indifference.
That is the ultimate profound humility, isn't it? That our entire history, all our technological achievements were only possible because the physics of the universe allowed for a brief, localized moment of warmth and dynamic climate stability. We were just guests who forgot we could be evicted.
And finally, that environmental description, the new sound outside the enclave airlocks. It just encapsulates the sheer finality of this Snowball Earth.
The sound of the new peace, the wind howling at immense velocities. The source suggests 300 kilometers per hour, uninhibited by topography or vegetation, and it's carrying the fine, pulverized dust of cities.
So the remains of New York and London have been worn down into fine powder by eons of ice and wind erosion.
And that's the sound. This is the planet's new peace. The peace of the vacuum, the peace of the absolute zero. Nothing moves, nothing lives, nothing changes except the dust shifting on the frozen surface.
A sound that is the loudest quiet you could possibly imagine. The Earth sighing under the weight of its own inertia. This deep dive into the eternal winter has been a sobering, highly detailed look at planetary feedback loops and the absolute limits of resilience. We've meticulously detailed the terrifying simplicity of the albedo death spiral.
The catastrophic biological shock of the trophic cascade, and the structural collapse of civilization under the slow violence of the urban glaciers.
The key takeaway for you, the learner, has to be the sheer power of seemingly minor atmospheric changes, like that initial volcanic dimming to trigger irreversible global mechanisms.
The Earth is a complex machine, and once its self-regulation is overwhelmed and it crosses that thermal threshold, stasis, in this case, frozen death or high entropy equilibrium, is a very real outcome dictated purely by physics.
But I want to end on a thought that the dossier closes with, which offers this strange, cold irony that builds on the philosophical reckoning we just discussed.
Oh.
The source notes that the stars are brighter now than they ever were. They're being viewed through an atmosphere that has been scrubbed completely clean of moisture, pollution, and any kind of dust. It's the ultimate pristine view of the cosmos.
A perfect, crystal clear observatory in the sky.
Yes. But the cost was the entire world. And that raises the question, what is the true value of that pristine view, of a perfectly clean atmosphere, if there is, and I'm quoting, no one left to navigate by them? If the price of scientific perfection and observation is the eradication of the observer, what use is the knowledge? It leaves us with a truly provocative thought. Perhaps the greatest value of a clear, bright sky is not the stars themselves, but the community of observers below who have the warmth and stability to appreciate them.
A difficult but necessary thought to mull over.
Thank you for joining us on this very cold deep dive. We hope this has given you plenty to reflect on as you look up at the sky tonight.